A white police officer stops a black woman during a routine traffic check, but what he doesn't know is that she's a powerful and respected judge. What follows is an unexpected chain of events that will leave you speechless. This gripping story explores prejudice, power, and poetic justice, all wrapped in one unforgettable moment. Stay until the end. The twist will shock you. Subscribe for more true story-inspired content with powerful messages. Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your perspective. It had been, by all accounts, a beautiful evening. Justice Althea Monroe, a 62-year-old federal judge and pillar of integrity in the city of Brookhaven, had spent the night surrounded by warm applause and gracious smiles. The annual Voices of Valor charity gala had honored local citizens who had gone above and beyond to serve the community. Althea had presented an award, shared a few heartfelt words from the podium, and basked in the soft glow of admiration. Not for her title, but for the decades she had given to fairness, equity, and justice. Wearing an elegant deep emerald gown that shimmered gently beneath the chandelier lights, her silver hair swept into a dignified updo, Althea carried herself with the grace of someone who knew who she was and what she had overcome. As the gala ended and the night air settled cool and calm over Brookhaven, she walked to her car, heels tapping softly against the pavement, the city twinkling quietly in the distance. The streets she drove through were familiar, tree-lined and peaceful, winding toward her gated neighborhood where porch lights flickered like sleepy stars. But as she neared the final turn, a jarring flash of red and blue lights erupted behind her, shattering the serenity of the evening. Her stomach tightened. She glanced in the rearview mirror, heart beginning to race. She wasn't speeding. Her tags were current. She had done nothing wrong. Still, she eased the car to the shoulder, placed it in park, and took a deep breath. Her hand moved instinctively to her purse, retrieving her identification and her judicial badge, which she placed on the passenger seat in clear view. The badge, polished gold with her name and title engraved beneath the seal of justice, had always been enough. It was her shield, her truth, her proof. With calm fingers, she rolled down her window. The crisp air rushed in. Then came the sound of boots on pavement, measured and slow. She turned to see a towering figure approach, Officer Mason Griggs, white, broad-shouldered, his expression unreadable, but his energy unmistakably hostile. No greeting, no explanation, no professional courtesy, just a sharp voice cutting through the night. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. Hands where I can see them." Althea's brows knit in confusion. She kept her voice measured. "Officer, I'm a federal judge. I'm returning home from a city-sponsored event. Is there a reason for this stop?" Griggs didn't flinch. He didn't ask for her name or her ID or her destination. He barely looked at the badge glinting under the soft dome light. His mind had already decided. A black woman, driving a luxury vehicle, late at night. That was all he saw. And for Griggs, that was enough. "I said step out. Now, or I'll force you out myself." In that moment, the years of courtroom rulings, legal victories, community service, and public respect vanished in his eyes. He didn't see Justice Monroe. He didn't even see a human being worthy of respect. He saw a target, a threat, a narrative that had nothing to do with who she was and everything to do with the color of her skin. Althea sat frozen for just a breath, hearing not just his voice, but the echoes of every story she had read, every case she had ruled on, every name she had whispered in moments of sorrow, names of those whose dignity had been stripped under flashing lights on quiet roads. But she was not new to this world. She was not afraid of uniforms, or raised voices, or unjust power. She took another breath, reached for her phone, and quietly hit record. Then, with the same dignity she had carried all evening, she opened her car door and stepped into a storm she had hoped would never come to her doorstep. The cool night air brushed against Althea's face as she stepped out of her vehicle, the low hum of the police cruiser behind her a constant reminder of the threat cloaked in authority. Her heels met the pavement with a quiet resolve. She held her judicial ID in one hand, her badge in the other. Not out of pride, but necessity. Proof, evidence of a life spent serving justice, now reduced to a silent plea for recognition. She turned to face the officer directly, lifting her voice just enough to be heard, but keeping it calm, unwavering. "I am Justice Althea Monroe," she stated firmly, holding out her credentials. "This is my ID. I would like to know why I was pulled over. Griggs, still posturing with one hand hovering near his holster, glanced at the badge with little more than contempt. A scoff escaped his lips. You match a suspect's description, he snapped, voice edged with accusation. Althea's brow furrowed. A suspect? She asked, her tone even but incredulous. What description, exactly? Griggs didn't flinch. Black female, late 50s or early 60s, driving a dark vehicle. Silence fell for a moment, thick as fog. Althea blinked slowly, absorbing the absurdity, the cruelty, the lazy, dangerous vagueness of it all. She took a breath. The kind you take to hold back a scream or a tear or an anger that's had centuries to ferment. That's not a description, she said quietly but firmly. That's profiling. But he was already in motion. Turn around, arms out, do it now. He didn't ask, he didn't explain. He commanded, as if her name, her title, her humanity meant nothing. Althea turned, lifting her arms with practiced grace. This wasn't the first time she'd seen abuse of power, but it was the first time she felt it pressed directly against her skin. His hands moved over her coat and down her arms. The pat-down was rough, unnecessarily so. Not a search for weapons, but a display of dominance. She clenched her jaw, heart pounding behind her ribs. The indignity of it all was suffocating, but she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. When Griggs reached for her purse on the car seat, Althea's hand moved slowly into her coat pocket. She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen with quiet precision. The camera lens blinked to life. This stop is being documented, she said clearly, her voice cutting through the thick silence like a scalpel. That was the moment the atmosphere shifted. Griggs froze, his movements less certain now. The arrogance in his posture faltered, not from guilt, but from awareness. Awareness that he was no longer in the shadows of unchecked power. He looked up and around, and for the first time, he noticed the others. Across the street, porch lights had begun to flicker on. The neighbors, mostly quiet, working-class families who'd lived alongside Althea for years, had stepped outside, drawn by the flashing lights and the raised voices. One woman stood wrapped in a robe, hand over her mouth. A man held his phone up, recording steadily. And there, perched on the steps of a nearby home, a teenager held his phone high, camera pointed directly at the unfolding scene. He hadn't looked away since the moment the lights lit up the street. The weight of the uniform had shielded Griggs before, but now it was that same uniform under a spotlight. He couldn't hide behind his badge, not when the truth was being captured from every angle. And still, Althea stood, her back straight, her arms slowly lowering to her sides. The cold still bit at her skin, but it was nothing compared to the chill that had settled deep in her chest. She had spent decades upholding the law. Tonight, she had been made to feel like a criminal, not for what she had done, but for who she was. But this story wouldn't end here. Not in silence, not in fear, because this time, the world was watching. The night may have ended quietly on that small street in Brookhaven, but by morning, the world was wide awake. Within just an hour of the incident, video clips began surfacing across social media platforms. Grainy cell phone footage, shaky at times, but crystal clear in its message. The camera didn't lie, and neither did the calm, steady voice that echoed through those recordings. Justice Althea Monroe stood in front of her vehicle, surrounded by flashing lights and a man who refused to see her humanity. But she didn't yell. She didn't beg. She spoke with the poise of someone who had spent a lifetime upholding the very laws now being used to humiliate her. One video, recorded by the teenager across the street, captured the moment she declared, "This stop is being documented." The way she held her phone, not in defiance, but in defense, struck a nerve. By dawn, the hashtag Justice Monroe was trending nationwide. Within 24 hours, it had crossed borders, becoming a global conversation about race, power, and the cruel irony of injustice inflicted on a woman who represented justice itself. People were outraged, heartbroken, and awakened, many for the first time, to the horrifying truth that no amount of accomplishment, no title, no status could shield a Black person from the venom of systemic bias. In Brookhaven, the reaction was swift and deeply personal. This was their judge. The same woman who volunteered at local schools, who sat on the board of youth outreach programs, who hosted annual justice and community town halls to bridge the gap between the legal system and the people it served. She had been their speaker at graduation ceremonies, their advocate in courtrooms, their mentor and model. And now, she had been reduced, in the eyes of one officer, to nothing more than a suspect. Protests erupted in front of the Brookhaven Police Department. Not just angry chants, but impassioned voices, holding signs that read, "Dignity denied," "See her," and "She is the law." Local churches held vigils. School students wrote letters of support. Community leaders stood shoulder to shoulder with neighbors, demanding answers and accountability. And through it all, Althea remained composed. She could have disappeared. She could have stayed behind closed doors, nursing the emotional wounds in silence. But that wasn't who she was. 4 days after the incident, she stepped into the spotlight once more, not as a victim, but as a voice. At a press conference held on the steps of the federal courthouse where she had ruled for years, Justice Monroe stood tall, wearing a navy blue suit, her silver hair softly framing her face, eyes steady as they met the sea of cameras and reporters. She didn't need a script. Her truth was enough. "This is not just about me," she began, her voice carrying the weight of both sorrow and strength. "It is about a system, a deeply broken system, that has taught men like Officer Griggs to see people like me as a threat, not because of anything we've done, but because of the skin we live in, no matter our titles, no matter our accomplishments, no matter our age." There was a long pause as she let the silence settle. "I have spent my life defending the law," she continued, "but now I must ask, who defends us when the law forgets who we are?" The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. She didn't rage, she didn't accuse, she illuminated. By the time she finished, some were in tears. Others applauded, not just out of support, but reverence, for the courage it takes to turn personal pain into public purpose. That day, Justice Monroe wasn't just a judge. She was a mirror held up to a nation that needed to see itself clearly, flaws, fractures, and all. And from that moment on, her story became more than an incident. It became a movement. The ripple of outrage had turned into a wave, and it came crashing down on the Brookhaven Police Department with unrelenting force. Public trust, already fragile in many communities, shattered under the weight of what had happened to Justice Althea Monroe. The videos had left no room for ambiguity. There was no justifying the aggression, no explaining away the disregard for her credentials, her status, or her basic rights. The world had seen it, and more importantly, they remembered. Under immense pressure from the public, from civil rights groups, and from city officials who knew inaction would only deepen the wound, the department had no choice but to launch an internal investigation. But this time, it wasn't just a quiet review behind closed doors. This time, the spotlight was searing. Officer Mason Griggs was suspended within 72 hours. At first, the department issued a standard statement: "We are committed to due process and a full review." But it wasn't enough. People demanded transparency, accountability, not just promises, but change. As the investigation unfolded, disturbing truths emerged. Griggs, it turned out, wasn't a first-time offender. The records, once buried in bureaucratic files and ignored by internal affairs, showed a pattern. Over the years, multiple complaints had been filed against him, nearly all from people of color. Allegations of unnecessary force, of hostile language, of intimidation without cause. Time and again, these complaints had been dismissed or quietly closed with no follow-up. Now, those cases were being re-examined, and the silence that once protected him had been broken. Justice Monroe's experience had pulled the veil back, and the city could no longer pretend this was an isolated incident. Faced with overwhelming evidence and public outcry, the Brookhaven Police Department made its decision. Officer Mason Griggs was terminated, his badge stripped, his authority revoked. The announcement came with a press conference of its own, but it lacked the grace or moral weight of Monroe's. The police chief, flanked by legal counsel and city officials, read a prepared statement about rebuilding trust and taking allegations seriously moving forward. But the truth was, this reckoning hadn't come from within. It had been forced by the unwavering spotlight of public attention, the courage of bystanders who refused to look away, and the unshakable composure of a judge who chose to stand tall in the face of humiliation. Still, something began to shift. New policies were drafted in response. Bias training, once a checkbox procedure, became mandatory and comprehensive. Officers would no longer patrol without functioning body cameras, and a civilian oversight board was formed to investigate future complaints independently. it wasn't everything. Not by far. Systemic change is slow, often frustrating, and always met with resistance. There were those in the department who grumbled about political correctness, who whispered about Griggs being thrown under the bus. But for the first time in a long time, voices demanding reform were louder and being heard. City Hall began hosting open forums. Community leaders who had once been ignored were now being invited to the table. And in classrooms, churches, and coffee shops, people were talking, not just about what had happened, but about why it had happened and what it revealed. No one was under the illusion that justice had fully been served. But for the people of Brookhaven, and for many watching across the country, the removal of one officer was a beginning, a message, that the weight of a badge did not place someone above the law, that silence would no longer protect misconduct, and that even the smallest moments, a phone raised, a voice recorded, a judge refusing to shrink, could spark a reckoning that demanded more from those in power. Her story traveled far beyond Brookhaven. It was featured in national documentaries, quoted in books, echoed in courtroom speeches. And through it all, Althea remained grounded. She still drank tea in the mornings, still walked her dog through the park, still ruled on cases with fairness and clarity. But now, when people looked at her, they didn't just see a judge, they saw courage made visible. Her presence reminded people of what justice was supposed to feel like. Not just legal, but moral. Not just fair, but human. She became the spark that lit 1,000 fires, in young lawyers who decided to fight discrimination in courtrooms, in activists who demanded body cam transparency, in neighbors who vowed never to turn away again when they saw injustice happening before them. Althea didn't ask to be a hero. She never claimed that title. But in standing her ground, not with rage, but with reason, not with hate, but with hope, she carved her place in the hearts of people who needed to believe that courage could still matter in this world. There are stories that fade, and then there are stories that shake us awake. Justice Althea Monroe's story was the latter, not because she was powerful, but because in the moment when power tried to strip her of her worth, she reminded us all of something timeless and unshakable. That dignity cannot be taken, it must be surrendered. And she never surrendered. If this story moved you, if it made you think, reflect, or feel something deeper, then don't let it stop here. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that shed light on the real experiences shaping our world. Your voice, your awareness, your action, it starts with being informed. Stay with us, and let's keep watching, speaking, and standing together. Subscribe now and join the conversation.